Welcome back to the Crimson Chat, where Jayhawks meet innovation. I'm your host, Jaden Hill, and today we're turning down the temperature and turning up the impact. We're spotlighting a KU-grown startup that's tackling one of the most overlooked climate and engineering challenges: how we cool our world without heating the planet. Joining me are two leaders behind Icorium Engineering Company, a Lawrence-based Kansas venture focused on sustainable refrigerant technologies. Dr. Kalin Baca, a chemical engineer, entrepreneur, and advocate for sustainable engineering practices. Kalin is the CEO and co-founder of Icorium Engineering Company. She earned her PhD in chemical engineering from the University of Kansas in 2023, graduating with honors. Her research focused on using ionic liquids to separate azeotropic refrigerant mixtures via extraction distillation, and she delivered over 15 technical talks, contributing to numerous publications and participated in the national programs like NSF I-Corps. She also holds an MS and BS in chemical engineering, plus an MBA from the University of New Mexico, is a Lean Six Sigma Green Belt and a champion for diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially for women in STEM and entrepreneurship. Dr. Abby Harders, a PhD chemical engineer dedicated to developing sustainable solutions for industrial problems. Abby is head of research and development at Icorium Engineering Company. Before joining Icorium, she completed her PhD in chemical engineering with honors at KU, focusing on membrane technologies for separating azeotropic refrigerants. She also holds BAs in both chemistry and mathematical sciences, giving her a powerful interdisciplinary toolkit for tackling complex challenges in the chemical industry. Their shared mission? To rethink how we handle refrigerants, from separation and recovery all the way to sustainability, by bringing cutting-edge separations, science out of the lab into the industry. Kalin, Abby, welcome to the Crimson Chat. Before we dive into science and the startup journey, let's start with just a few quick get-to-know-you questions. So first, what pulled each of you towards chemical engineering?
Yeah, I would say for me in high school, I really enjoyed chemistry, enjoyed math. My dad was a civil engineer, and so when I was picking my kind of degree, chemical engineering seemed like a good fit. I will say I did not know much actually about the practice of chemical engineering when I signed up and started. But as I got more into school and got more into understanding the practice and the impact that chemical engineers can have, I found that it was a really good fit.
Yeah, kind of similar story. So really, I first started out with just a chemistry degree in my undergraduate studies, then just kept taking math classes because I love math, decided to double major, and then through a research experience for undergraduates program that I did at the University of Kansas, really figured out that chemical engineering was a good way for me to merge those two fundamental concepts and studies into one kind of distinct pathway, which was chemical engineering for me.
Yeah, and you've done a lot of research, but what kind of brought you into the entrepreneurial space?
Yeah, for me, I took my first business class ever kind of as I guess an accident almost, where I took a organizational behavior diversity class, and I kind of fell in love with the idea of how you build teams, how you kind of grow that side, and became just interested in business. That led me to get an MBA. That led me to get introduced to people at the University of New Mexico Innovation Academy, where I was able to be a graduate assistant for them, get introduced to pitch competitions. So it was really like a step into the entrepreneurial world.
Absolutely. And for you, what brought you into engineering?
Yeah, I think kind of similar. I really loved chemistry and I love math. And then I had the opportunity to meet Dr. Shiflett, who would then be my PhD advisor, through the REU program. And really just the way that problems are looked at and solved in chemical engineering, I really related with and identified with and thought it was a good use for my skills and aptitudes, just to look at things and problem solving in a really process-oriented way. So I kind of found that that was my passion through that research experience and never looked back.
Yeah, and how did you two meet?
PhD program.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was in the PhD program.
Yeah.
Did you guys work on projects before you ended up joining her company, or how did that work?
Yeah, so we were both doing our PhD research on, with Dr. Mark Shiflett, and both focused on separating refrigerants and technologies for separating refrigerants. I was focused more on membrane technology during my PhD, Kalin more on ionic liquid technology, so obviously a ton of overlap there trying to solve the same problem.
Yeah.
So there was just kind of a cohesiveness between us.
So first off, let's start with your PhD and work at KU, as we mentioned, on ionic liquids and extracting, distillation, all of that. Can you kind of explain to us, to those who don't do chemical engineering, what that means?
Yeah, so essentially most of the separations that we do with distillation are all temperature based, and that doesn't work for refrigerant mixtures because the mixtures that we have, often the components form what's called an azeotrope, which just means those components are going to have a consistent boiling point, and they're going to have a consistent composition. And so when you think of that, you need something else besides temperature to actually separate those mixtures. And so that's where extractive distillation comes in. We use a solvent, an ionic liquid in particular, that is able to be added to that distillation tower, and it's technically the part that is actually separating or facilitating that separation of the mixture.
Gotcha. And how does this, actually work with refrigerants? Why does this cause cooling? I mean, we can see the effects of it, but how does that work? Do you want to take that?
Sure. Yeah, so we're not so much focused on the cooling side of things. We're more focused on what happens to these refrigerants after they've been used in cooling applications, after that they're at their end of life. So we want to make sure that the entire refrigerant industry and market is as circular as possible, and help on kind of the end of life handling of refrigerants. And that's where separation makes a big impact. Right now, there really isn't the ability in the industry to separate azeotropes and extremely complicated refrigerant mixtures, and these mixtures are getting more complicated with time. And so the extractive distillation technology, the membrane technology is all geared at providing separation solutions for refrigerants at their end of life.
Okay, so how does the company come into this? So obviously there's a lot of research behind this, but what exactly does your company sell or do?
Yeah. So we obviously did research on the actual kind of science behind the separation technologies, right? Us as a company, we got into the business of actually providing that separation as a service into the refrigerant reclamation industry. And so when you think about refrigerant reclaim, there are reclaimers who exist today. And they are really the piece that's at the end of life for these refrigerants. They are making sure they can take things that come out of systems that are used, clean them up, so remove air, remove water, remove oil and lubricant, and then do some level of separation. Like we said, there's some limitations there with azeotropes and complexity, and then they're able to resell that refrigerant back into the market. And so really what we do as a company is we plug into that existing supply chain, that existing market, and we offer another technology solution, which is our separation-based technology.
So you mentioned the lifetime of refrigerants. What does that mean, and how long is a lifetime of a refrigerant?
I mean, refrigerants don't really go bad, is maybe a nice way to say it. They're very, very stable, which is why we love them as refrigerants. So as long as you can clean them up, as long as you can separate them and put them back into the blend you want, you can reuse them over and over and over again. And that's ultimately why they're such potent greenhouse gases, is because they do have that long lifetime, and they're also really good at holding on to heat, which makes sense because that's kind of their job as refrigerants.
No, that makes sense. And you guys mentioned that this kind of started at the PhD program with Mark Shiflett. Can you guys walk us through what were your PhD projects and just kind of maybe go into the details on that?
Yeah. So all of this, like Kalin said, started kind of throughout the research we were already doing at KU. So my project was focused on separating refrigerant mixtures using membrane technology and membrane-based technology. And so that technology is not driven by heat at all. It's driven normally by solubility differences or size differences in molecules that permeate through what's called a polymer. And so they can go through these polymeric materials at varying rates. And so you want to develop materials that are very selective towards specific components, so that one side of that membrane can have the components, one part of the component, and then the other side can be enriched in a different molecule.
And why is that important to have that membrane separate these two?
Yeah, so, like Kalin was talking about, refrigerants are very difficult to separate. They were designed that way intentionally so that if they leak out of your system, the composition isn't changing. So there's a good reason for why that these refrigerants are hard to separate by conventional distillation. But in order to fully use their value and also recycle and reuse them at end of life, we need to be able to separate the components so that they can be cleaned up and reused, reblended, and really just given new life and allowed to be used again. So with a membrane-based technology, you can do that by just differing rates of permeability. That's what we would call in the membrane world. And another part of my project was, as chemical engineers, we need to make sure that solutions that we're developing are scalable. So we can find a polymer that might work very well, but is this going to be relevant industrially? So part of my project was to develop coating technologies and module fabrication technologies to take these membranes from just a small lab scale and be able to produce them at kilometers at a time.
How do you decide what's relevant? Like, how do you know what's going to be helpful or not helpful? Or is that kind of just like the technology that you designed was to kind of help figure that out?
Yeah, I mean, in the membrane world, you need a polymer or a membrane material that has, again, a high permeability. That means that one of the components can go through it very fast, so there's a high flux. You also need it to be very selective so that not everything goes through it. So on the beginning stages, you'd be trying to identify a material that meets both of those criteria. And then, that's just the starting point. Is this going to hold up to your operating conditions? Is it scalable? Can you make it into actual large-scale modules?
Yeah, and for your PhD project, so I assume it was not membrane-based.
It was
so
not.
What was yours?
Yeah, so I was focused on the physical property measurements of ionic liquids with refrigerants. So the thing that all of our separation technologies kind of have in common is we look for selectivity. And so that's kind of a common thread between all of them, where we want whatever material we're identifying to be very selective for certain refrigerants and not for the other ones. And so for me, I was looking at that for ionic liquids. So which ionic liquids are going to have really high solubility of certain refrigerant components and kind of hopefully ignore the other ones. And so when we were looking at these, I was doing mostly the vapor-liquid equilibrium measurements and those types of things, which are essentially the baseline for models. And so we take all that data, we put them into Aspen, which is a chemical engineering software, and then we use that to build models to say, okay, is this separation going to be possible? What does that look like? We're able to compare that to pilot scale operations. So we have a pilot scale tower that's actually at KU. It's in a high bay area with the chemical engineering department. And so you're able to take all that kind of data and plug it into that. For me, I was really focused on the property measurement and identification of, are there ones that work better? What differences in ionic liquids makes differences in that selectivity? So that's really where my focus was, along with then kind of more the business side, where I got to be able to do the National Icorium program and other things which we're pushing forward and developing. Is there an actual market for this technology, and do we have the space to create a company?
No, absolutely. And to even go a couple steps back, because again, I have a little bit of information because I have talked to Mark Shefflett before. What exactly is a refrigerant? Because of course, like the thing that everyone's going to think of is a refrigerator,
Yes,
because it's just so close. But what are all the different things that refrigerants are used in, just to like give people an idea of the scale of what we're talking about here?
I mean, refrigerants are the working fluid, so it's the actual component, or like, I guess, material that is inside your refrigerator that does the cooling, or inside your air conditioner, or your car, or at the grocery store, or in your big building, like we're in now. So really, they're the fluid that's doing the work. And so when you think about what they're used for, they're used all over the place: vaccine storage, food storage, transportation. Comfort, obviously, entertainment, but they're used at an extremely large scale globally. And so it's not just something that's used here in the US. The world uses all the same refrigerants. And so when we talk about this as a challenge in the separation world, that's not just something that we're facing here in the US, that's something that globally we are tackling.
Are there other global initiatives that are looking at, similar issues like you are, that are kind of maybe trying to move forward to figure out how do you separate them, how do you make that life cycle work? Are there other projects going on that you know of?
Yeah, I think this problem, you see it through legislation here in the United States, through the AIM Act. That's really what is kind of pushing this increased regulation of hydrofluorocarbons, which is today's generation of refrigerants. You also see that maybe even more of a presence of those regulations in the European Union, in the EU. And so there are some research groups in Europe that are looking at solving this issue as well, that we've done some collaboration with in the past. And then there's also research groups here in the United States also looking at this. But in terms of, industrial focus on separating this solution and in the real focus separation of azeotropic refrigerant mixtures, that's a little bit more sparse.
Yeah. And do you want to talk a little bit more about the legislation? What's actually in it? Is there something that people should know about when it comes to this refrigeration and the fact that it does, contribute to climate change? What's in the legislation that's good, maybe bad?
Yeah, so through the AIM Act, it calls for an 85% reduction of today's generation of refrigerants, which are hydrofluorocarbons, by 2036. We're about 40% of the way into that phase down, so this is already happening. And, like Kalin was talking about, these are super pollutants, so they trap heat in our atmosphere, and this is something that industry, we believe, should be focusing on. It's something important, and we're glad that there's focus on that through legislative means. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, I would just say that when you look at these phase downs, this is the second time this is happening. So we've actually already gone through a refrigerant phase down. The first time was because we had chlorine in our refrigerants. So the hole in the ozone, that was kind of a climate crisis that was being contributed to by refrigerants. And so we phased down the production of those refrigerants and transitioned to what we use today. And then today's are very high in global warming potential. And so when we think about a phase down also in their use, that means really a phase down in production. And so when you think about the actual impact of that, you're going to stop producing the refrigerant that goes into existing units. And refrigeration equipment often has a 20-30 year lifetime. And so there can be a gap between sometimes the amount being produced and maybe the amount needed to go into those existing units. And so that's also a big area where reclaim and having the technology to be able to effectively reuse and recycle these refrigerants becomes really important.
And when you do recycle those refrigerants, can they go into different types of things? Maybe this is a ridiculous question, but can a refrigerant used in a car go into actual refrigerator or stuff like that? Can they kind of be used throughout with different stuff? Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Well, so kind of. I would say when you think of refrigerants, there's a whole bunch of pure components. And so there's common ones that you'll see that are used in a lot of different blends, but it's ultimately today, it's mostly blends that are being used in specific applications. And so what you'll see is if you can separate fully, like we're able to with Icorium's technology, you're able to reblend that refrigerant into whatever commercial blend that you need. And so in that regard, yes, you can reuse those in the application that makes the most sense as long as they are put back into spec for that commercial application.
I'm just thinking of, moving forward with maybe electric cars or different technology innovations, if we're able to, reuse that for different things, that might be, a good thing to be able to have. But also I was going to say, we're looking at this impact, and you mentioned how there could be that gap. Do you foresee there being a gap because of this new legislation? Or do you feel like you guys are going to be able to catch up and make that, not have a gap?
I mean, we're doing everything in our power to ensure that we can, help bridge the gap between, there's a huge demand for refrigerants and for cooling technologies. And like what Kalin was saying with phase downs in production, there definitely are projected gaps between the supply and the demand side. And so we really see this as an impactful way to help, bridge that space and ensure that there is equal and equitable access to cooling technologies.
And we mentioned that this has a pretty long lifeline, which is why it has such a big effect on the climate. It has those global warming tendencies. If you cut down on the production, you guys hit that benchmark goal that the legislation is going for. Are we going to see direct effects to climate change, or is it going to take a long time for the climate to get rid of those because they are so long lasting?
Well, so when you think about limiting production, you're slowly phasing out the use long term, which is going to take a while for that equipment to phase out. So, and the reality is when we think about, it's not so much maybe the production side, it's the fact that we know that refrigeration systems leak. Yeah. So the reality is at some level, units leak. And they do it pretty consistently. There's some pretty clear industry averages depending on where you're at. And so for us, it's more about saying, okay, these refrigerants do have a detrimental impact if they are released. We know at some level they're going to leak. So let's start the transition to refrigerants that have less global warming impact. The other side of that is you don't want to replace every single refrigeration or kind of cooling equipment piece all at once. That also doesn't make sense. And so bridging that gap is phasing out slowly the use of these materials, but also ensuring that we can use the equipment we have and make sure that we're able to make it a smooth transition. And really end of life, also ensuring that things aren't just vented. That's really where we want to be, where when there is that decision point and you're able to say what happens to this refrigerant, we want to make sure that it is separated, reused, recycled efficiently, and instead of just being stockpiled, which happens a lot, or destroyed, and I say destruction, it's incineration, which doesn't really destroy the refrigerants, it just changes what it looks like. So you might take a hydrofluorocarbon and it might now be broken down into something like HF and CO2. And so it's really just changing what it is, maybe turning into something that's a little bit less environmentally impactful in that regard, but still not actual destruction.
Yeah. Is there anything that people can do, like when it comes to this? Because it feels like it's a really big issue, and we all, are aware of the climate change crisis. With the technology that you're talking about and refrigerants in general, is there stuff that like ordinary people can do or apply to their own, systems?
I mean, I would say ask where your refrigerant's going. I mean, that's the first thing, and just learning a little bit about these materials and knowing what's happening to them. I think that's a great first step. It is a very complicated space in the sense that there's a lot of legislation, there's a lot of different refrigerant blends out there, and to be honest, I don't think many of us actually think about refrigerants on a daily basis. I think we are in the minority there where we are actually thinking about these things every day. But every time you open your refrigerator, every time you turn on your air conditioning, you're using this critical material.
So would you guys suggest like trying to cut out some use of like the air conditioner maybe on those like fall seasons where it's a 60-degree day or something like that? Is that helpful, or does that still not really do anything because it still kind of leaks? Like maybe that's a bad question. Do you get what I'm trying to say? Like, is that helpful?
I mean, energy use is like that from that side, but
yeah, because I think when you think about like an air conditioner, there's the side that we're focused on, which is the use of the refrigerant, what happens to the refrigerant at end of life when it's leaking throughout the use. But there's also just the energy usage of the air conditioning system itself, which is another side of the environmental impact of cooling technologies, refrigeration. So in that regard, yeah, if you're not running your air conditioner, that's impactful. But we also want people to be comfortable.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But that's what I always try to think when we're talking about these really abstract concepts, and I get to talk to some people doing amazing research. But I'm like, is there any way that people can apply this? One of the honors seminars that I TA for is talking about climate emotions. I know a lot of people feel really distressed, but then it's like I feel like I can't do anything, right? Because it's like there's all these big factors, and me using a paper straw doesn't feel like it's making a big difference. And so that's why I always like to bring in, are there actionable things that people can do and say, well, at least, I can do something. And that's better than nothing type of thing, I guess. But yeah. And what do you guys think you're going to do moving forward? I'm assuming continue the company, but do you have any other projects that you're planning on working on?
I mean, right now we are fully engrossed by just developing the separation technology. So we're building out the research team, we're building out the company, and really what we're doing is we're trying to finish piloting. which we're supposed to do by the end of this year, which is really exciting for the extractive distillation technology. And the next step for that is actually getting it into commercial use. And so we are actively going through the steps right now to figure out what we need to do to build a plant site and looking at key partners and identifying funding sources. And then besides that, we have 2 other technologies that we are actively scaling and looking to get into pilot scale so that we can complete testing and then hopefully also transition to commercial.
Yeah. I'm sure for you, obviously, you're along for the ride. What does your role in all of this kind of look like?
Yeah, I think for me, since we're at a small startup company, our roles change from day to day. We have a lot of back and forth and sharing of roles just across our entire team. But my main focus is really how these technologies can be used efficiently, how we can scale them, and how we can make sure that they get to commercial deployment. So like Kalin was saying, the furthest along technology is the extracted distillation technology. So that's what our team, is really dug into right now through piloting, through advanced modeling, to make sure that we're meeting the market and providing that solution. In addition to that, we're also scaling the membrane technology and pressure swing adsorption using porous materials. So my main focus is making sure that the technology is where it needs to be and that it meets the needs of the market.
Amazing. And was there anything that surprised you about the entrepreneurial side of things after going from researching for so many years?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're going to be problem solving, you're going to be handling new things every day, but I think just the amount of kind of change that you get, or the amount of, variation in your day-to-day, I'd say that's still somehow surprising, even though you know it's going to be there. But I think, honestly, we have a fantastic team. We have an incredible support network around us, and so for us, we're just getting to enjoy building the company, building the technology, and that's been incredible.
Yeah. Is there anything that you guys feel like viewers should know about the work that you do, your company, or just you yourselves?
One of the things I think is so important to share is how we are a team of engineers who were able to start doing research in a very impactful area. That's something that personally is really important to me. I really love that we get to have an impact not only on a global scale from a climate technology perspective, but we also get to have an impact on people's daily lives. And so for me, that's something that as engineers, I think you should just know that you're able to go into these spaces, you're able to not only create impact through your research, but you also have the ability to go out and start companies and be able to actually put that research into the world, into practice, and see that impact in a very real way.
Well, I appreciate you both so much in the work you do. I know there's so much that has gone into this. You've had so many different degrees and PhD programs, and now you're starting your own company, and it's really amazing, and it's really cool that you're using this to really change the world. We talk about this as a very niche area. Not a lot of people are doing this, and I think it's really amazing that you're here in Lawrence at KU doing this. And so it's just been a pleasure to talk to both of you guys. Thank you so much for your time. To our viewers, stay curious. Make sure you follow us on social media for all of our updates and to know what guests are coming up next. And we'll see you next week.